"Let me teach you how to use water," the officer roared, gripping the nozzle as he blasted a freezing torrent onto the chest of the 78-year-old woman who stood shivering in the dead of winter. He smirked and brushed off his sleeve, treating the old woman's agony as a cheap price to pay for a single water spot on his polished patrol car. But that smile vanished the moment a black SUV screeched to a halt, blocking his view. Stepping out was no panicked civilian, but a man with a gaze colder than ice. On his shoulders gleamed 3 silver stars, a Navy Vice Admiral and Special Forces commander who had witnessed everything. What began as a petty act of bullying quickly escalated into a seismic legal battle. This wasn't just a complaint, it was the total dismantling of an entire police department as they collided with the combined might of the military and federal justice. Will a badge be enough to hide his crimes, or will this abuser of power pay with both his career and his freedom? If your elderly mother were humiliated like this on her own doorstep, would you stand by or fight to the end? Let us know in the comments. And watch until the end, because the Admiral's retaliation is something you won't be able to turn away from. The morning before Christmas Eve carried a half-awake, half-dreamlike air, the kind of cold that made people pull their collars higher, yet could not dampen the quiet anticipation drifting through every home in Hawthorne Hill. Along Elmwood Drive, dew still clung to the strings of holiday lights, and a few dry leaves rested on the steps as if waiting for someone to walk past and give them an excuse to rustle. In the house, at the end of the street, Mrs. Evelyn pushed the door open and stepped into the yard with a wool scarf draped loosely over her shoulders, holding a garden hose she had not used in a long while, but wanted this morning so she could water the rose trellis before her son returned home. The pale morning sunlight slid across the roof of the house opposite hers, casting a thin, slightly curved shadow at her feet, curved the way age had gently shaped her posture. Mrs. Evelyn bent down to inspect the sprayer head pressed lightly on the hose that had stiffened after so many unused months, then looked toward the rosebuds just beginning to open. This morning, she wanted everything to appear tidy, taken care of, because on this Christmas Eve, she did not want her home to look like the cold dwelling of an elderly woman living alone. She twisted the valve gently, but only a few drops came out. She added a bit more force, her wrist trembling so that the sprayer twisted off center and water burst out in a wildly skewed arc. A sudden jet of cold water curled through the air like a silver snake waking from sleep, whipping sharply before her face and startling her into losing her breath. Before she could correct the direction, she heard the hum of a car engine from the street. Officer Grady's patrol car was rolling slowly, its window cracked open so he could take in the cold air and sharpen his senses. He had been quite satisfied with his morning. The car had just been washed and polished meticulously because today was internal inspection. Day one of the few chances he had to prove he was not the kind of careless officer others assumed him to be. But the exact moment he leaned his face toward the window, the stream from Mrs. Evelyn's hose shot straight onto his cheek collar and the entire front of his gleaming vehicle. He braked so abruptly that the tires let out a short squeal, then sat frozen for several seconds as if he could not believe what had just happened. Cold water continued sliding down each strand of hair at his temple, seeping beneath his collar and sparking a shiver of discomfort and irritation. He swiped the water off his face with force, then looked at his CA, now marked by uneven streaks that cut through the polished wax like ugly veins. The car, the thing he had fussed over all morning, now looked as though someone had intentionally dirtied it to mock him. Grady shoved the door open and stepped out with undisguised annoyance. His eyes immediately darted toward the person responsible. Mrs. Evelyn stood before her rose trellis, her body slightly hunched, still gripping the hose as if afraid it would misbehave again. He looked at her, then at the car, and the irritation in his eyes sharpened into unmistakable contempt. To Grady, things like this were never accidental. Someone always had to be careless. Someone always had to be irresponsible. Someone always had to make a man like him suffer inconvenience. His fragile pride found a target instantly. Mrs. Evelyn tried to turn the hose back toward the trellis, but the line was caught somewhere, causing the water pressure to twist and splash straight onto Grady's black shoes. Just a short jet of water, but enough to make him inhale sharply in anger. Leaves around the yard shivered as his voice cracked loudly through the air. "What do you think you're doing?" The man barked, his voice rising even higher than the hiss of water sputtering from the misaligned nozzle. The shout echoed across the quiet neighborhood, sending a flock of birds scattering from the trees opposite the yard. Mrs. Evelyn stepped back, her whole body curling inward in fear. She opened her mouth to say something, but the sound was so faint that even she could barely hear it. She managed only, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean," but the words fell into space not strong enough to reach a man already blazing with fury. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady the hose as though guiding it back in place could undo what had happened. Grady did not see the trembling. He saw only an old woman fumbling and dirtying his patrol car on an important day, an image that made him feel insulted and belittled. For men like him, respect was never earned through proper conduct. It was demanded, proven by exerting power over someone weaker. And standing before him now was the easiest target for every frustration inside him. His eyes darkened. The hose in Mrs. Evelyn's hands was releasing only the last weak spurts of water, but that did nothing to cool his temper. The wind carried the scent of damp plastic and cold water across the yard as Grady stepped closer, reducing the distance between them until Mrs. Evelyn could see the red blotches forming on his neck. Across the street, a few dry leaves tumbled along the pavement, but no one saw what was unfolding except Grady, Mrs. Evelyn, and the rose bushes still dripping from the splashed water. Hawthorne Hill remained peaceful, though that peace was now only a shell. Grady lifted his eyebrows a muscle, twitching in his cheek as his irritation swelled in his chest, and he took another step forward, making no effort to hide his intent. From the look in his eyes, anyone could tell that within the next few seconds, this would no longer be a matter of an accidental stream of water. Grady stood facing Mrs. Evelyn with a look that could not hide his disdain. The cold of the morning before Christmas Eve swept across the yard, placing the two of them in a fragile space suspended between calm and uncertainty. Wind threaded through the rose bushes behind her, a few leaves falling at her feet and curling across the sidewalk, making soft, dry sounds as they turned. Grady paid no attention to any of it. Nothing mattered except the sting to his pride, the sense that the car he had tended with such care all morning was now streaked with water like crude slashes across his thin layer of self-importance. He looked at Mrs. Evelyn from head to toe as though evaluating someone who had clearly broken the law. From her worn shoes to the purple dress darkened where it had been splashed to her hands, trembling from cold and fear. His brows pulled low, the lines of his face tightening into a scowl as if her very existence were the reason his day had become a tangled mess. He spoke in a voice half shout, half mockery. "Do you even have eyes? You think you can splash water on a police car?" His voice was sharp and hard, cutting through the morning air and causing Mrs. Evelyn to lower her head even more. She tried to speak, "I'm sorry, it's broken," but her voice was so faint that the drip of water from the sprayer hitting the brick walkway sounded louder. She could hear the tremble in her own breath, feel how fear was tightening around her chest. She looked toward Grady, but could not hold his gaze, terrified that the hardness of his stare would shrink her even further. Grady stepped closer now, near enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he wished. His breath came with the lingering scent of coffee and irritation, a combination that made Mrs. Evelyn instinctively curl inward like an old bird bracing for a storm. He growled, "I didn't hear anything. Speak up." The pressure in his voice pushed her toward the edge of exhaustion, her fingers clenching the hose as though gripping the last stable thing in a world suddenly tilting off balance. She opened her mouth again, but the tremor in her body pulled the words into a weak choke. Her eyes dropped to the sprayer as she tried to twist it, hoping to fix her mistake, but before she could do anything, Grady glanced back at his car at the streaks clinging to the paint like undeniable evidence of disrespect. He lifted his head, his tone thick with reprimand. "Do you know how long it took me to clean that car? You think being careless just makes it go away?" Each word fell like a small stone building into a mound of pressure on the shoulders of the elderly woman standing before him. Mrs. Evelyn shook her head, her cheeks quivering from confusion. She had no desire to argue or resist. She only wanted to fix what had happened, to explain that she had not meant it, that the old hose had acted up because it had not been used in so long. But panic made her hands shake harder, and the last remaining trickle of water dripped onto the bricks, each drop sounding sharply in the otherwise still yard. Those droplets felt like they washed away any chance of forgiveness, marking new lines of fault that Grady seemed determined to hold against her. He noticed her trembling, and a thin, cold smile curled on his lips, the smile of someone who felt he held absolute power over a person too weak to push back. "That's right. Keep shaking. You messed up, and you can't even look me in the eye." The words grew out of contempt, more than anger, landing like blows on the fragile dignity of an elderly woman. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against her dress and pressing the fabric to her legs. A fallen leaf landed on her head and slipped down her shoulder, but she didn't notice. She was trying to hold her tears back, trying to steady her voice, trying to reclaim a normal breath. But in front of her stood a uniformed officer, a man whose mere presence was enough to make her feel she no longer had the right to explain. Grady moved another half step forward, as if he had found the excuse he needed to unleash the resentment he had been storing for a long time. Every disappointment in his life, every unspoken pressure at work, every slight he thought he had suffered from colleagues, all of it seemed to gather in him now, seeking a place to be released as he towered over a frail woman with no means to defend herself. The yard in front of Evelyn's house remained quiet. The neighbor's home still shut, a few small potted plants swaying on the steps in the breeze. None of them could speak, yet the sense of injustice hung heavily in the air. Mrs. Evelyn saw Grady's hand curl and uncurl as if he were choosing the moment to grab onto something, and before she could guess what was coming, he lunged his hand toward the hose she was holding. The hose being yanked from her hand made Mrs. Evelyn stagger, as if she had just lost the only thing keeping her steady. Her hand reached out into the air, searching for a surface or object to anchor herself to, but found nothing except the sharp December cold. Her scarf slipped off her shoulders, falling onto the brick walkway and soaking through instantly. The morning before Christmas Eve remained peaceful throughout the neighborhood, yet within this small yard that peace had been stretched so thin it felt ready to tear. Mrs. Evelyn wobbled, her vision blurring for a moment, the world before her tilting as though pivoting on an unseen axis. Grady did not give her a second to regain balance. He jabbed a finger toward her face, thick, blunt, accusing. "I told you to turn it off. Are you deaf?" His voice snapped sharp as a needle, piercing her ear, making her flinch. The harshness drowned out the rustling leaves, the wind, and even the small droplets hidden the ground. In Grady's mind, she was no longer an elderly woman who had made an honest mistake. She was now the perfect excuse, a target he could use to reassert his authority, to shake off the sting of feeling insulted over what had happened to his car. Mrs. Evelyn tried to respond, her lips trembling with fear. I didn't hear clearly." The words stumbled, buried under her quickened breaths. Her age and the stress made her voice falter. She had no way of knowing that her statement would be like pouring fuel over the flames already burning in Grady's temper. He heard the phrase not as an explanation, but as the sort of excuse he believed people like her always used in an attempt to dodge responsibility. He curled his lip and let out a short, contemptuous laugh. Always the same, I didn't hear clearly. People like you are always the same." His words seeped into the cold morning air, making it feel even sharper than the winter wind. If a neighbor had happened to glance over at that moment, they would have seen a uniformed officer standing in front of an elderly woman, and instead of helping her, he was using words like weapons against someone no longer quick enough to defend herself. Mrs. Evelyn lifted a hand slowly as if to signal him to calm down. The movement was so shaky it was almost unreadable. She could not even close her fingers tightly. She simply raised her hand as though trying to shield part of her face from his gaze. But the slowness of the gesture only convinced him that she was avoiding him, resisting him, fueling his belief that she was being defiant. Everything inside his head passed through the lens of wounded pride, not reality. "You're disobeying an order. Do you understand?" That his voice shot out fast and hard, like a stone tossed into water. He pressed on and on, forcing Mrs. Evelyn into a situation she didn't even comprehend. What had begun as an accident was now, through his words, twisted into failure to comply, as if she had committed a serious offense and was trying to evade responsibility. Mrs. Evelyn stepped back instinctively, bumping lightly against the wooden railing behind her. The rail, weakened by age, let out a faint creak, as if even it could not withstand the tension pressing down on her. Her eyes widened with fear. Her entire being seemed lost amid his rapid accusations, and his face increasingly shadowed by anger. She was not used to being shouted at, not used to being cornered without escape. Her life had been quiet, gentle, and lived among kind neighbors on a peaceful street. Never had she imagined she would be treated this way. Grady stepped closer again, reducing the space between them to something thin enough that, in a few breaths, she would be forced to look directly up at him. He held the hose in his hand, like an object symbolizing his authority. His fingers tightened around the tube, giving the impression that he was gripping control over her space, her air, her ability to stand steady. Water still clung to his cheek, highlighting the anger etched into his expression as though she were solely responsible for his humiliation. His breathing quickened partly from tension, partly from the sense that his pride had been challenged. He could not see her frailty. He saw only a target he had to overpower. Her silence, her shaking hands, her uttered, I didn't hear clearly in his mind, they were provocation signs that needed to be crushed to reaffirm his position. And he began wanting to push everything far beyond what the moment warranted. In that instant, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp grass and weathered wood from the old railing, adding even more weight to the air. Everything in the yard seemed to hold its breath, bracing for something worse. Water pooled at the sprayer head and slid down onto his hand in a cold line, but he didn't feel it. His mind was consumed by the desire to assert dominance over the woman before him. He tightened his grip, sealing his decision, and as the pressure built again inside the hose, a sudden, forceful jet of water burst from Grady's hand, shooting directly toward where Mrs. Evelyn stood, erasing the last fragile path of explanation she had been clinging to. The powerful stream from Grady's hand struck Mrs. Evelyn's shoulder so hard that it left her dazed. She turned instinctively to avoid it, but her frail body could not move fast enough, causing the Christmas wreath she had been holding to slip from her grasp. The wreath dropped onto the brick walkway with a soft but chilling sound, then rolled several times across the water-streaked yard. The green of the leaves and the red of the ribbon smeared against the wet ground, creating a fragmented image that tightened something in her chest. She watched the wreath the way one might watch a small piece of hope fall away from their hands. The wreath rolled until it stopped near Grady's foot. A small sprig had snapped off and lay alone on the damp brick. The sight made Mrs. Evelyn feel her heart stumble in her chest. She had spent all of last night adjusting the wreath, making it look just right for this morning so she could hang it on her door before her son returned home. It was a symbol of Christmas joy, something she longed to preserve even as the years had stripped away much of her strength. Grady looked at the wreath and let out a short, pleased laugh. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to freeze her spine. There was something twisted in that laugh, as though her fear, an old woman's fear, brought him a strange, cruel satisfaction. His eyes flicked from the wreath to her, his expression openly triumphant, adding a heavier weight to the yard than the winter sky ever could. She bent down to pick up the wreath, her trembling fingers reaching toward it, as if retrieving it could salvage a small shred of dignity from this chaotic morning. But the moment her fingertip touched the edge of the wreath, water shot from the hose in Grady's hand, again striking the back of her hand and making her flinch violently. The force wasn't enough to cause serious injury, but it was cold and stinging, forcing her to yank her hand away at once. Drops of icy water ran down her arm, making her shiver as she tried to stand straight, though her body shook like a leaf caught in the wind. Grady stepped forward half a step, his voice low but razor sharp. "Don't pick it up. I'm not done." His tone didn't need volume to instill fear. It carried a quiet threat the kind elderly people like Mrs. Evelyn could sense with painful clarity. People who hold power when they speak like that rarely stop at words. The air in the yard seemed to compress into a single point, making it hard for her to breathe as she faced him. She fought to keep her balance, her hands reaching slightly for the wooden railing behind her. Her eyes drifted toward the broken wreath lying helplessly on the brick, and in that moment she felt something inside her fracture too. The wreath wasn't just a decoration, it was something she had prepared for the day her son returned after many months away. It held her anticipation, her hope, the warmth she tried to build within her small home. Seeing it broken in the middle of this confrontation felt like a cruel message she didn't know how to withstand. From the window across the street, Mr. Harris watched. He had seen everything from the moment the patrol car screeched to a stop to Grady stepping out with that sour expression. His aging fingers clutched the wooden window frame when he saw the water hit Mrs. Evelyn, making his heart clench. His eyes widened in shock and outrage, unable to comprehend how a police officer could treat an elderly woman that way. He wanted to intervene, to step outside and stop it, but his weak legs and the memories of past encounters with aggressive officers held him back. A cold gust swept through Elmwood Drive, carrying the faint ringing of someone's wind chime, but the morning's peace was gone. The yard now resembled a stage where the powerless were cornered without escape. Mrs. Evelyn looked at Grady with pleading eyes, hoping he would stop, but there was no hint of mercy on his face, only the stubborn aggression of a man determined to prove his authority by stepping on someone else. Mr. Harris let out a strangled sound when he saw Grady lift the hose again, aiming it at Mrs. Evelyn. Her frail body stood still, knowing she lacked the strength to endure another hit. Her back curved slightly, her shoulders trembling, and her hand gripped the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. In that moment, she felt something unfamiliar spreading through her, a mixture of fear and deep sorrow, the kind that comes when one realizes the world can be terribly cruel to those no longer strong enough to defend themselves. Grady tightened his grip on the hose, increasing the pressure. His face tilted slightly, his eyes hardening into something darker irritation turning into cruelty. He no longer saw Mrs. Evelyn as a person with years' fragility or dignity. He saw only a figure he could command and punish because the badge on his chest allowed it, or at least he believed it did. The water burst forth stronger than before. It sliced through the air in an instant, striking the center of her back. The sudden blast made her collapse onto the brick walkway, her knees slamming against the ground. A gasp of pain escaped her lips, blending with the horrified expression of Mr. Harris across the street, still standing behind his window, powerless to do anything but witness it happen. The forceful blast across her back made Mrs. Evelyn's breath choke, as though someone had gripped her lungs. She pitched forward, raising both hands to shield her face, but the cold water sliced through her fingers, striking her skin like tiny blades. Her back burned with numb pain, her purple dress clinging heavily to her legs, and the weight of her body collapsing onto her already weak knees made her feel as though she might crumble entirely. The sharp scent of cold water mixed with damp earth rose sharply into her nose, blending with her frantic breaths and turning her dizziness into a whirl. In the chaos of that moment, the splashing water, the broken fragments of breath, a memory surged up stronger than the stream beating against her body. She heard the echo of a man shouting long ago on an afternoon when she had still been a young woman stepping into a corner store where she and her sister were shoved back out onto the street for no reason but the color of their skin. She saw the glass door slam shut, heard the store owner's voice, dripping disdain, felt the humiliation pressing down on her shoulders so heavily she wished she could disappear. She had spent a lifetime trying to forget that day, but now it returned with cruel clarity, so vivid she could hear the scrape of her sandals on the concrete floor of that long-ago shop. Grady barked next to her ear, "Get up." His voice was sharp, slicing into her memory as if he were the reincarnation of those white men from that distant afternoon. He did not see the woman before him shaking from pain and the ghosts of the past. He saw only an old woman refusing to do what he wanted. He had no understanding of the weight his words carried, but Mrs. Evelyn felt them like a hooked blade dragging her back through every moment she had endured humiliation without the strength to fight it. She tried to twist her body to stand, but her knees buckled immediately as she pushed against the wet bricks. Every movement felt heavy, as if the stream itself were pinning her down. The soaked fabric of her purple dress clung to her legs and tangled her movements, and a faint whisper slipped from her throat. "Please." The word was as fragile as a flower stem snapped by the rain. Too soft, too thin to persuade, too weak to travel far, too gentle to reach the man towering over her with domination in his eyes. Water struck her face, forcing her eyes to squint shut. She could no longer tell what was the spray from the hose, what might be stray droplets from the cold air, and what were tears trying to escape. The world dissolved into a milky blur, and she felt herself losing direction. She glanced at her own hand, shaking uncontrollably, then down at the wet bricks darkening beneath her, each drop sinking in like a wound pressed into her memory. Across the street, Mr. Harris tapped frantically against his window, his aging hand trembling with fury. His heart tightened at the sight unfolding before him, the injustice unmistakable. Yet his legs were no longer strong enough to carry him across the road. Each tap against the glass was like an attempted shout, but his throat constricted, refusing to give him a voice. He had lived through years of mistreatment himself. Seeing it happen again was like being struck in his own chest. His eyes followed every motion Grady made with a mix of fear and outrage, but the house across the street felt like an unbridgeable distance. Inside Mrs. Evelyn's coat pocket, her phone vibrated again. Nathaniel was calling. The gentle buzz felt like a faint knock against her heart, stirring a tiny ember of hope her son might be on his way. He might hear her voice if she could only lift the phone. But water was splashing across her hands. Grady's shouting crashed over her, and her pounding heartbeat drowned out every sound. The phone kept vibrating, but she didn't hear it. The connection she needed most flickered uselessly out of reach. Grady bent lower, his warm breath brushing her face despite the cold water surrounding her. He spoke in a low voice, dragging each word like a serrated blade over wood. "You listen when I speak. Understood." The threat in his tone was unmistakable, chilling her spine more deeply than the water pouring over her. He stood so close, he blocked the faint winter light, casting a large shadow across her body. That shadow pressed down as though smothering what little hope Christmas morning had left her. Mrs. Evelyn gasped, her hands weakening, her palms swollen from holding herself up. She felt the weight of her years bearing down all at once, along with the rising terror she thought she had buried decades earlier. The fear came not only from pain or humiliation, but from the helplessness of being treated as someone without a voice. In Grady's eyes, she was merely an elderly woman undeserving of respect. But within her heart, the losses and wounds of a lifetime were being torn open again. The water continued dripping from the nozzle, carrying its coldness across her skin. Droplets slid down her neck, down her spine, merging with the damp brick below, as though dissolving into her unending sadness. Wind rustled through the trees, creating a hollow hum that made the moment feel even more suffocating. The faint scent of smoke from someone's fireplace drifted into the yard, blending with the smell of earth and water, tightening her throat with its heaviness. The house across from Mrs. Evelyn's still glowed with the soft yellow light of the kitchen that morning, where Mr. Harris had been preparing his first cup of tea. He was accustomed to standing at the window watching the gentle movements of Hawthorne Hill each morning, observing the slow, peaceful rhythm of the street. But the loud shout echoing from Mrs. Evelyn's yard made him jolt, causing him to drop his spoon into the teacup. He hurried to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and froze when he saw the blast of water knocking Mrs. Evelyn to her knees. His aging hands trembled violently, gripping the window frame as though keeping his own knees from collapsing as well. His breath accelerated, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. Before him was the image of a woman he had known for nearly 20 years, kind, quiet, gentle, being forced into a situation no one should ever face. The shock mingled with fury, sending a wave of hot and cold up his spine until he staggered. He whispered through his panicked breath, "No, it can't be like this." Memories from wartime flooded back: the time he was thrown out of a diner because he wore the wrong color uniform, the time police stopped him without cause and hurled degrading questions at him. All of it rushed over him like a cold wave. He knew far too well what it felt like to be crushed by authority, especially when the one being crushed was a black civilian. Seeing Mrs. Evelyn treated that way made him want to shout, but emotion strangled his voice. He tried to open the door to run outside, but his weak knees nearly gave out on the tile. Age had stolen his quickness, making every step feel heavier. He steadied himself on the table, then turned back for his phone. A suffocating anger rose inside him at the thought that if he were still young, he would have run out the moment he heard the first shout. But now, all he had were hands scented with medicated ointment and legs too soft to intervene directly. He dialed 911 with shaking fingers, his palm damp with urgency. His breath came in gasps as he said, "An officer is attacking an elderly woman right in front of 114 Elmwood. Please send someone." The dispatcher seemed unfazed, asking routine verification questions, forcing him to strain to speak clearly, despite the energy draining from him with each word. His fear at witnessing injustice, combined with his anger, made his voice crack, but he pushed himself to speak with precision. In his mind, the scene played back in slow motion. He saw each droplet striking Mrs. Evelyn's face, her frail hands raised to shield herself, her purple dress plastered against trembling legs. Each blast tore at him, reminding him of black neighbors who had endured unfair treatment while no one intervened. He wanted to break the door and run, wanted to shout Grady's name, wanted to do anything to stop the cruelty, but his elderly body would not obey. Into the phone he continued urgently, frustration and helplessness woven into every word. "He's not stopping. He's spraying her directly." The dispatcher assured him that a patrol car was being sent, but that did nothing to ease the heaviness in his chest. Every passing second seemed to weaken Mrs. Evelyn further, and the sight made his entire body tremble. Returning to the window, he saw Grady leaning close to Evelyn. The officer's posture chilled him. Grady's eyes glinted in a distorted way that only someone who had survived too much injustice could recognize, the glint of a man who believed he held absolute power over someone vulnerable. Grady stood so close that his shadow engulfed Mrs. Evelyn, casting a dark shape across the already damp and cold yard. Outside, Outside, wind scattered several flyers from a lamp post, sending them swirling as though trying and failing to obscure the awful scene. Thin, winter sunlight streaked the wet bricks of Mrs. Evelyn's yard, creating uneven patches of brightness. Against that contrast, her collapsed figure beneath the stream looked even more tragic, even more haunting. Mr. Harris felt his heart tighten until it hurt. His anger surged and he pounded harder on the window pane, though he knew it accomplished nothing. He wanted to shout Grady's name, wanted to tell him to stop, but he feared his voice would not carry or would not be strong enough to stop a man driven by wounded pride. He had met men like Grady before, men who used authority as armor and fed their egos by provoking fear in others. His breath quickened, but his eyes never left Evelyn's yard. He saw every movement Grady made every time he raised the hose again. Every second, Mrs. Evelyn struggled to stay upright, and in that moment of near despair, another sound began to weave itself into the morning's chaotic noise. It was faint, but powerful, like the engine of a large vehicle drawing near. The heavy military SUV rolled along the suburban road leading into Hawthorne Hill, its weight sending a low, steady hum through the otherwise quiet morning. Reed leaned gently back into his seat, a familiar warmth easing into his breath as he thought of the old porch, his mother's rose pots, and the simple meal she always prepared whenever he came home. Years in the service had taught him the true value of peace, and the moment of seeing his mother's smile had always been what he longed for most. He pulled out his phone as the vehicle passed the first turn into the neighborhood. The gesture had become routine whenever he returned from deployment. He called her, hoping to hear the warm voice that always told him drive slowly or reminded him to bring a coat if the weather turned cold. But the ringing stretched on, hollow and unbroken, deepening the line across his brow. He watched the screen light up and fade when the call went unanswered. His first feeling was surprise. His mother rarely missed a call, especially when she knew he was on his way home. Reed tried to reassure himself. She's probably in the kitchen, he muttered under his breath, attempting to push away the unease edging into his thoughts. But his hand stayed wrapped around the phone. He called again this time, letting it ring longer, hoping her voice would slip through the soft rumble of the engine. But again came the prolonged silence, the steady ringing that ended only in emptiness. A weight pressed against his chest. He recognized the feeling one carved deeply into him by years on the battlefield. It was the instinct of someone who had faced danger often enough to sense when something was wrong, even from subtle signs. His mother's silence wasn't like her. It carried something colder, something that made a draft run through the hollow inside him. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was long past the hour his mother normally watered her plants. She always woke early, opened the doors to let in the morning air, and tended to the red rose trellis she had planted when her husband was still alive. At her age, those small routines were both joy and daily exercise. The fact that she wasn't answering now only deepened the wrongness. A quiet dread spread through him, thickening the air inside the SUV. The vehicle suddenly felt heavier, as if echoing the rising tension in his mind. He swallowed, trying to regain his composure, but his throat felt dry as though he had not drunk water for days. He knew he tended to be overly alert when it came to his mother, but the instincts forged from years in danger had never misguided him. Reed tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes shifting toward the road leading into the neighborhood. Familiar houses emerged behind the trees, but the usual sense of calm was gone. He saw quiet rooftops, Christmas lights still unlit, and cars parked neatly along the curb. Everything looked normal, but inside him an unseen alarm continued to ring. His thought came sharp and clear. Something's wrong. It was as though someone had whispered it directly into his ear. The unease grew, forcing him to accelerate. The engine responded with a deep rumble, shifting into a stronger rhythm as if sharing its owner's urgency. The SUV moved faster through the familiar bends, its tires cutting through thin traces of morning dew. He tried to breathe breathed evenly, but the breaths came short with tension. He pictured his mother standing in her yard, watering her plants. He pictured her gentle smile when he appeared at the door. He pictured the Christmas wreath she always kept ready to hang each holiday season. The images layered over one another in his mind, pushing him to reach home sooner. The morning wind grew stronger as he drove deeper into Elmwood Drive. The street remained empty, save for the echo of his engine across the wide quiet. But then his eyes registered movement in the distance, something unusual. Flecks of light scattered in the air as droplets flung upward, catching the early sunlight. They arched and fell in curved trajectories. He squinted. His heartbeat stuttered, seized by a sudden inexplicable tension. Those droplets did not fall like dew, nor like runoff from a roof. They shot upward and out in deliberate arcs, as if propelled by a strong, forceful stream, and they appeared right ahead on the stretch of road that led directly to his mother's home. The air inside the SUV thickened until it felt suffocating. Reed sensed every heartbeat hammering faster, harder, splitting his breaths into ragged halves. He no longer thought about staying calm. He no longer tried to reassure himself. A fierce tension surged inside him, making his hands grip the wheel without conscious thought. The SUV tilted slightly as he swung sharply into Elmwood Drive, the tires leaving a thin mark along the pavement. Morning light flashed across the windshield just as the scene came fully into view. The streams of water were shooting upward in violent, erratic bursts coming from the yard of a home he knew too well. A cold line crawled up his spine, sharp as a blade. Nathaniel Reed's SUV screeched to a halt right in front of the gate the moment he fully registered what was unfolding. Mrs. Evelyn, the woman who had spent her entire life keeping this home as a small sanctuary amid the chaos of the world, was now bent over, trembling hands shielding her head. The powerful stream from the hose slammed against her back like a cruel punishment. The sound of water striking the brick ground came in the sharp, cold rhythms, blending with her fractured breaths and tightening every muscle in Reed's chest. He pushed the car door open before the wheels had fully stopped. His foot hit the pavement with the sensation that the earth itself quivered under the weight of the fury he was holding down. His entire body surged toward the yard as if driven by instinct, yet each step he took was strangely slow and deliberate. It was not hesitation, it was the practiced calm of a man intimately familiar with the line between action and detonation. Nathaniel Reed, who had stood through hundreds of life and death moments, felt his heart heavier than ever while looking at this small, devastating scene at the home where he grew up. Mrs. Evelyn lifted her head at the sound of the arriving vehicle. Her vision was blurred with water and pain, but through the haze she still saw the silhouette of a tall man approaching. The outline was familiar enough that her heart tightened, and for a second she couldn't tell whether it was hope or a new fear swelling inside her. She looked at him again before recognizing her son. A flicker of relief surfaced, but it was crushed immediately by the stream still pounding into her back. Grady remained beside the hose, his expression disturbingly relaxed. He did not notice anything out of place when the SUV stopped behind him, nor did he sense Reed's presence as any threat to the authority he was abusing. He kept the hose trained on the trembling elderly woman as if it were his right to do so, as if there were justification for it. He even let out a faint smirk, one filled with contempt, like he was savoring a spectacle meant solely for his enjoyment. Reed walked forward slowly, each step marking the rise of the anger building inside him. His eyes were locked on his mother. Every water stain on her clothes, every tiny shiver in her shoulders carved themselves into him with brutal clarity. But within that gaze something else was forming, cooling into steel. It was the look of a man who had survived battlefields, who knew the exact moment fury must be unleashed, and the moment it must be refined into the sharpest possible blade. blade. His lips pressed into a tight line. There was no fear left in him, no shock, only a cold, focused resolve. Years lived on the edge had taught him that true danger did not lie in gunfire or explosions, but, in the moment, an innocent person was pushed into a place where they could no longer defend themselves. He had seen comrades fall, had seen civilians threatened, and he knew instantly when someone he loved was in danger. And now, seeing his mother trembling beneath the stream of water, every instinct he possessed ignited at once, sharper and fiercer than ever before. Reed stopped only a few steps from Grady. The short distance between them formed a clear border between the attacker and the one who had been harmed. His breathing was steady, terrifyingly controlled, each inhale and exhale deliberate. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to lunge, he simply stood tall and unwavering, and then he spoke his voice, not loud, but carrying undeniable force. Stop. The single word split the space in half. Every odd sound in the yard seemed to snap into silence. Only the gentle dripping from the hose onto the ground remained. Grady's hand froze. His movement halted mid-gesture, water still flowing, but no longer pressed into a stream. Reed's presence seemed to pull him back from the haze of power he had been lost in. Grady turned slightly, though not fully. His lip curled in mild irritation at being interrupted. He believed this was simply a neighbor sticking their nose where it didn't belong. His blind confidence kept him from even imagining that the man behind him was far from ordinary. Mrs. Evelyn exhaled weakly, the breath so faint it nearly disappeared into the sound of the dripping water. She looked up at her son, eyes full of tears, fear, and a fragile thread of relief. She couldn't speak. Her throat was constricted by emotion and exhaustion, but her gaze said everything that she had endured too much in the last few minutes, and she had no strength left to rise without him. Reed did not look away from her. His gaze, sharp and unwavering, carried a weight that Grady sensed even before turning fully. Something in the air shifted. Still grasping for his usual posturing, Grady forced out half a sentence, his voice edged with defensiveness. "Who do you think you—" He turned, trying to summon the intimidating tone he used to cow others. He never finished the question. He never reached the expression he intended to wear. His eyes met Nathaniel Reed's. That gaze held neither fear nor hostility. It was calm. So calm it was cold, as if it were looking straight into the twisted core of who he was. The effect made Grady freeze his breath, catching in his throat, and his heartbeat stumbling out of rhythm. Reed had not shifted even an inch when Grady turned. He remained still, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering. He only tilted his head slightly, his eyes drifting down to the hose still dripping in Grady's hand. The droplets fell in steady beats, each one a reminder of what had just occurred. In Reed's eyes there was no explosive rage, only a precise steadiness, the kind possessed by someone who had witnessed far worse and knew that true danger never announced itself with shouting, but with the silence before impact. He said, "That's enough." 2 words, low anchored and final, but the moment they entered the air, the entire yard seemed to drop a degree colder. His voice was not loud, yet its depth seemed to touch the ground itself, sending a faint vibration through the wet bricks. Each word carried the weight of discipline of a life spent understanding exactly where lines must be drawn. The sentence made Grady's neck tense. He could not understand why such a short command tightened something around his chest. Grady's grip on the hose loosened unconsciously. He did not even realize he was letting go. Water continued dripping onto the toes of his boots, seeping through the leather and chilling his feet, but he was no longer aware of any of it. He felt himself being pulled toward the quiet force radiating from the man in front of him. Behind that calm was an authority difficult to name, an authority that made "that's enough" sound less like a request and more like a directive he had once heard in brutal training sessions. Reed took one more step, keeping a respectful distance so he wouldn't press against his mother, who was still collapsed beside him. He continued, Put it down." Each syllable was crisp and absolute, spoken with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding people who never dared argue. Grady's pulse hammered in his ears. His hand opened fully, and the hose dropped onto the brick with a small clatter that echoed across the morning quiet. Mrs. Evelyn lifted her head, her tear-blurred eyes seeing her son standing before her. Her breath trembled as she whispered, "Nathaniel." Her voice shook partly from exhaustion, partly from the overwhelming shock of seeing him arrive at the precise moment she felt she could not endure another second. Her surprise mingled with relief, forming an emotion both joyful and choking, as if she had just grasped a hand pulling her back from the edge. Grady glanced around, scrambling to reclaim the authority he believed he owned. He looked at the patrol car parked out front at his uniform at the street where he was used to throwing his weight around without anyone pushing back. But none of it gave him confidence now. In this moment, all the props that usually upheld his sense of power meant nothing. Standing before him was a man who did not flinch, did not fold, and whose presence alone made Grady feel small. Reed leaned down and lifted his mother gently, slipping his own jacket around her trembling shoulders. His movements were soft, yet steady, the kind of care he had always carried for her through the years. He placed a hand on her back and helped her rise slowly, ensuring she wouldn't grow dizzy. Mrs. Evelyn leaned into her son, feeling the familiar steadiness she had longed for during the silent days waiting for him to come home. The wet bricks reflected the morning light, mirroring the silhouettes of the mother and son standing together, an unexpected point of brightness in a scene otherwise filled with tension. The wind passed through the rose trellis, carrying the scent of sun-warmed stems and damp soil, but it did nothing to ease the knot forming under Grady's ribs. He watched them, feeling a widening distance between himself and them, a distance so vast it made his chest tighten. Reed straightened once his mother was secure. Then he turned to face Grady fully. His expression did not show explosive anger. It held a stern, severe clarity that anyone who had ever been seriously reprimanded would recognize instantly. It was the face of a man who had made countless critical decisions, a man who knew exactly which lines could never, ever be crossed. Grady stepped back, a tiny, involuntary motion. He tried to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to defend himself in the way he always did. But his lips dried and his throat constricted. The words wouldn't rise. He felt Reed's gaze cut through not just his recent actions, but through the thin shell of authority he hid behind the flimsy armor he used to cover his own insecurity and fragile pride. Mrs. Evelyn clutched her son's sleeve as if to steady him, or herself, or both. She looked at Grady with fear still lingering, but Reed's protective stance in front of her brought back a fragile sense of safety. Her eyes carried deep gratitude mixed with sorrow for everything that had unfolded. Reed lowered his hand from her shoulder and stood tall in the center of the yard. For the first time, he looked directly at Grady, assessing him the way one evaluates someone who has just committed a grave offense at one's own doorstep. There was no barrier left, only the stark truth of the moment laid bare on a Christmas morning that should have been peaceful. Reed's voice was steady, low, and unshakably clear as he said, "You just assaulted my mother." Grady opened his mouth to argue, but Reed's gaze made his throat go dry. His expression shifted rapidly from aggression to confusion, then to fear. He stepped back half a pace, his hand gripping his belt as if trying to anchor himself, yet the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed him. Reed did not advance, did not push, did not lay a hand on Grady. He only stood there, back straight, gaze steady enough to freeze the entire yard in place. "I will handle this through the proper channels," he said, his voice unnervingly calm amid the thick tension. "Leave my property." On the ground, the hose still lay where it had fallen, the nozzle turning slowly with the last trickle of water, a living piece of evidence of what had just been done. Reed turned away, prioritizing the only thing that mattered, helping his mother stand. He carefully slipped his arm around her shoulders and guided her toward the house, while Grady stood frozen unsure, watching mother and son disappear into the doorway. When the door clicked shut, Grady spun around, stumbled back toward the patrol car, climbed in, and started the engine so frantically that the roar echoed down the entire street. He drove off as though chased by the consequences of his own actions. Crossing the threshold, Reed felt the cold of his mother's soaked clothing seep into his palm like a physical reminder of what had just occurred. He helped her onto the sofa, the warm lamplight falling across her pale face, revealing every faint tremble of her lips and eyelids. The house was so quiet that Reed could hear her unsteady breaths blend with the drip of water falling from her silver hair onto the floor. He retrieved a dry towel and wrapped it gently around her shoulders, moving with extreme care as though any rougher touch might hurt her. Evelyn clutched the edge of her wet clothing, her breath still unstable, shaped by lingering shock. She looked up at her son, her eyes blurred with tears, but still trying to hold the composed expression of a mother who never wanted her child to worry. Reed said nothing yet. He reached forward and brushed aside the damp hair clinging to her forehead, feeling beneath his fingertips the cold and fragility he so rarely associated with her. It had been a long time since he'd seen her look this vulnerable. An hour later, a short knock sounded at the door. Dr. Cooper stepped in with his medical bag, and his eyes darkened instantly as he took in Evelyn's condition. He set the bag on the table, removed his gloves, and gently lowered the collar of her shirt to examine her shoulder. Beneath the wet fabric, bruises had already begun to spread long, dark patches that looked like fingerprints of cruelty pressed into her aging skin. Dr. Cooper leaned in closer, his brow tightening as he pressed lightly with 2 fingers. Evelyn let out a soft cry, a trembling sound, so small it made Reed clench his jaw to keep himself steady. Cooper placed a reassuring hand briefly on Reed's shoulder before taking out his professional phone to document the injuries. Each soft click of the shutter echoed in the silent room, sounding like the slowed heartbeat of someone holding back fury. The force was strong and directed to the shoulder, Cooper said, jotting notes while glancing at Reed. Not accidental. This was deliberate, you know that. Hearing that, Evelyn gripped Reed's sleeve and whispered, her voice low and shaking like fragile wind, "Don't make this bigger. I'm fine now." But her eyes could not hide the deep ache, physical and emotional. Reed knelt in front of her, his gaze soft but heavy, so direct that Evelyn had to look away. "You were attacked," he said, each word cutting through the silence. "No one has the right to do that to you. I won't allow it." Evelyn blinked several times, her silver lashes wet the strength of a woman who had endured injustice for decades, flickering and faltering. In that moment, Reed understood that her pain had roots far deeper than just today. Cooper continued his examination, lifting the damp fabric to reveal a large, dark bruise stretching down toward the lower scapula. He inhaled sharply, then gave Reed a look filled with sympathy. "Her emotional state took a heavy hit," he said quietly. "Shocks like this do not heal easily at her age." He placed a bottle of pain medication on the table and instructed warm compresses to stabilize her body temperature. Reed's nod was silent, but sincere, filled with gratitude. When Cooper left, Reed stood alone under the porch roof. A cold breeze swept through, carrying the smell of damp earth and the remnants of water still scattered across the yard. His eyes fell upon the wet brick ground, muddy streaks, and the broken Christmas wreath still lying untouched. Each detail carved deeper into his memory like a warning his mother had suffered while he was not there to protect her. Reed stepped back inside. Evelyn now rested with her head against the sofa, her breathing steadier, but her eyes still echoing fear that had not yet faded. Reed gripped the edge of the chair, his fingers tightening as though anchoring the fragile peace he had just reclaimed. He knew this could not become another story buried under the label of a misunderstanding. He stepped back onto the porch and took out his phone. His hand was unnervingly steady, as if his entire body had locked into the mode of a man built to respond to crisis. When the line to the Naval Legal Service Command opened, Reed's voice was low and controlled, betraying none of the storm inside his chest. "This is Vice Admiral Nathaniel Reed. I am requesting an immediate investigation. Deploy a JAG officer at once. The response came nearly instantly, urgency snapping into place on the other end. Understood. Priority granted. Support will arrive today, Admiral. Reed ended the call, staring at the darkening screen before releasing a long breath, not from exhaustion, but to make room for the rising resolve inside him. He returned to his room, opening the large wardrobe where his olive uniform hung neatly, a silent emblem of the position he carried in a world few fully understood. Reed brushed his fingers along the thick fabric, then adjusted the collar and straightened the row of polished metal buttons. The light reflected off the 3 silver stars on his shoulder, the unmistakable insignia of a man who had commanded thousands. He looked into the mirror and saw the face of someone who had endured enough storms to know when to be gentle and when to turn into steel. The reflection was no longer that of a son drowning in the pain of his mother, but of a senior officer who knew exactly what must be done to ensure the truth was not buried again. He stood tall, inhaling deeply. "We need evidence." The words were not spoken loudly, but in the quiet house, they landed like a declaration marking the beginning of a path Reed was fully prepared to follow to the end. Reed pushed open the door and stepped back into the yard, the hinges letting out a soft sound, like the house itself was sighing after witnessing far too much for a morning meant to be peaceful. The cold air hit his face, carrying the scent of damp earth and leftover water from the chaos. The droplets on the brick ground had yet to dry, reflecting the muted midday light, slowly turning toward afternoon. Reed stopped letting the eyes trained by years of special operations take in every detail with precise attention. The hose lay tilted near the edge of the planter, the nozzle twisted as though ripped from the hands that had held it. Droplets fell in a slow rhythm against the bricks like a truth no one could silence. Reed knelt, lifted the nozzle gently and set it back into place, imagining his mother's hands desperately trying to hold on to it while being overwhelmed. He raised his phone and photographed the scene from multiple angles, ensuring every detail was captured. A muddy streak stretched from the flower bed to the middle of the yard. Reed walked closer, his gaze tightening when he saw Evelyn's footprints embedded within the smear. Small prints, short steps, trembling, all retreat as someone pushed back without knowing how to escape. He stood over them for several seconds, feeling his whole body grow heavier as he imagined his mother trying to avoid the stream of water, yet unable to get away. A light breeze rustled the broken wreath lying near the steps. She had prepared it yesterday, its pine scent still faintly clinging to the branches with a purple ribbon tied carefully the way she liked. Reed picked it up, and a broken sprig fell to the ground. He bent to retrieve the fallen piece, his fingers closing around it with a pressure that mirrored the feeling caught in his chest since the moment he saw her collapse under the stream. He inhaled deeply, pulling back the practiced calm of someone who had survived countless life-or-death moments, yet could still keep his mind clear. He photographed the damaged wreath, the loose sprig, and the water-streaked steps. In each frame, he saw a story no one could deny. Near the fence line, Grady's boot prints remained clearly etched into the soft dirt. They pointed directly toward the spot where he had stood like 2 arrows marking the origin of the violence. Reed approached and photographed each print. His hand was so steady that the phone felt like an extension of his body fused with his unwavering focus. Reed lifted his head and looked toward Mr. Harris's house across the street. The first-floor window was partially open, the white curtain shifting slightly, a quiet sign that someone had witnessed everything and had been forced to watch in helpless silence. Reed photographed the yard from that angle, noting what Harris could see and what he would later testify to. Every fragment of evidence mattered, and Reed knew how to assemble them into a complete picture. The breeze carried the crisp scent of the approaching evening. Reed stood motionless for a few seconds, eyes scanning the yard again. Here, scattered droplets marked each moment of fear. Damp bricks marked each moment of humiliation. The broken wreath marked each moment of silent suffering, and all of it pressed against Reed's heart with the weight of knowing his mother endured it while he was not there. He walked back to the hose and examined the nozzle, touching the twisted joint to confirm the angle. It had been forced hard enough to leave a small scrape along the knob. He photographed the marks from several angles, preserving the state of the equipment exactly as it was. As he bent down, Reed noticed streaks of water splashing across the wall near the steps. The droplets formed sweeping arcs, evidence that the stream had been redirected multiple times, strong enough to infer that Grady had deliberately lifted the hose high. Reed touched the wall lightly, feeling the cold still clinging to the brick, then photographed the pattern again. The entire yard now felt like a crime scene only he could properly safeguard. Reed stepped back 2 paces and took a wide shot from the porch, capturing everything from the hose to the muddy streaks, the broken wreath, Grady's boot prints, and the scattered droplets that resembled the fractured breaths Evelyn struggled to take. A coldness seeped into Reed's chest, not from the weather, but from the realization that his mother's yard, the place meant to be safest for her, had turned into a space where she was humiliated by someone wearing a uniform meant to protect. He rubbed a hand across his face, then lowered it again with renewed resolve. Reed climbed the steps to the porch and stood beneath the eaves, surveying the scene one last time. Each second passed slowly, but his mind worked rapidly, ordering the details, calculating the next moves. He understood perfectly that the evidence collected here had to be flawless, because he wasn't just confronting Grady. He was confronting an entire system likely ready to shield its own. He took out his phone, paused for a single breath, then tapped a special contact he rarely needed. The number connected directly to the Naval Legal Service Command, a line reserved for emergencies or matters of serious legal concern. Reed knew this moment was both. When the call connected, Reed straightened his shoulders, lowering in a composed, deliberate motion. His eyes moved to the yard that now held the imprint of his mother's pain, and his voice dropped heavy and clear. "This is Vice Admiral Nathaniel Reed. I am requesting an immediate investigation." His breath blended with the late afternoon chill as he continued, unwavering. "Deploy a JAG officer today." The voice on the other end responded instantly. Urgency snapping into place. "Understood. Prioritizing now. Confirmation will be sent shortly." Reed ended the call and lifted his gaze toward the darkening sky, letting the cold air strike his face like a bracing reminder. Everything was now in motion, and he would not stop until the truth was fully restored to the one person he respected most in the world. Reed stood on the porch as a cold wind swept through, letting him feel the chill threading along the sleeves of the uniform he was preparing to put on. His phone was still in his hand. The call to the Naval Legal Service Command freshly ended the screen, faintly reflecting the contact number reserved for matters grave enough to touch the most serious legal boundaries. He looked down at the brick yard before the steps where every droplet, every smear of mud, and every trembling footprint of his mother remained as if time itself had paused, waiting for him to act. The silence held for several seconds, an uneasy silence, the kind that pressed against the chest rather than soothing it. Reed tightened his grip on the phone, the cold metal against his skin helping stabilize his focus. He turned toward the door, peering through the small gap to ensure Evelyn was still resting in the living room as Dr. Cooper instructed. The warm light spilling through the crack softened him briefly, but everything else inside him burned with a determination no winter chill could put out. While Reed prepared his documents and uniform over at Precinct 12, Grady sat at his desk in the state opposite. The usually noisy duty room felt heavy, as if something enormous were about to crash down upon it. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on his hair, illuminating the dried water stains still clinging to his collar. He sat motionless for several seconds, his trembling hand knocking the pen off the desk. The cold down his spine had not left him since he drove away from Evelyn's yard. Morrison stood behind him, arms crossed, agitation and irritation determination woven plainly across his posture. His eyes flicked toward the blank report page in front of Grady, an expression twisted between disappointment and frustration. "Right," Morrison said, his voice low but sharp enough that Grady felt it slice across the back of his neck. "Right that she refused to comply. Right that the hose slipped from her hand. Right that you intervened for safety." Grady swallowed his throat dry, but the body cam, he didn't finish. Morrison slammed a hand onto the desk, making him jump. "You turned it off at the right time," Morrison growled. "There is nothing to worry about. Write exactly what I said. No more, no less." Grady lowered his head to the page pen in hand, but still trembling. When the tip touched the paper, the first words bent his stomach with a sharp twist. The suspect failed to comply with commands. Each word felt like another layer of mud smeared over the truth he was trying desperately to bury. He inhaled deeply, trying to continue, but every sentence grew heavier, harder. In his head came the echo of Evelyn's cry, the slap of water hitting her back, and Reed's voice, calm, deadly steady, saying, "You just assaulted my mother." Morrison leaned in, scanning each line and giving a curt nod. "Good," he muttered. "I'll take care of the rest." Grady nodded weakly, but the fear in his eyes did not fade. He felt as though the entire room tilted forward, as if something terrible waited at the bottom of the tilt. The air felt so tight, he had to lift his eyes to the wall in front of him just to stay upright. Back at Evelyn's porch, Reed had completed every necessary preparation. Standing under the awning, he straightened his uniform collar, letting his fingers brush across the 3 silver stars reflecting the dimming daylight. His eyes held a focus that belonged to a man preparing for a confrontation, not between one individual and another, but between justice and an entire system that might already be moving to shield wrongdoing. Reed stepped into the living room again and paused, watching his mother resting with her eyes half closed on the sofa. She was trembling less now, but her breath still came unevenly. He gently draped a thin blanket over her legs, then stepped back as if imprinting her peaceful image into memory before leaving. Though his face remained still, he knew this moment was the reminder, his reason to pursue the matter to its end. At Precinct 12, Grady shut the report folder with a sudden, desperate snap, as if hoping that closing the cover could crush the fear inside him. His breath came heavy, like someone who had just climbed a steep hill. When he lifted his head, he saw his own reflection in the glass panel of the duty room, a man he no longer recognized. It was not the confident officer from his morning mirror, but someone wagering everything on a lie. Morrison looked at him, expression tightening. "Stay focused," he said. "We'll handle this internally. You won't be left alone." But under Morrison's voice was a faint metallic tremor like steel under strain. A man who loved control, Morrison had not felt this kind of unease in years. Reed stepped out of the house, his boots touching the brick path now drying in patches, though faint watermarks remained. He stood tall and looked down the street that led toward the main road. He had walked this path countless times, but today it carried a new meaning. Today, it was a line connecting Evelyn's yard to Precinct 12, a line running from a mother's pain to a military officer's duty. A gust of wind rattled the trees in front of the house, making the structure hum softly. Reed inhaled, opened the car door, and slid into the driver's seat. The interior was familiar, the steering wheel, the scent of leather, but his state of mind had changed entirely. He started the engine, its deep, steady rumble sounding like the breath of a warrior stepping into battle. At Precinct 12, as Grady snapped the report folder shut and tried to calm his pulse, Morrison turned toward the door, hoping no one would question them yet. But just as he shifted his weight, the duty room door burst open, freezing both men as though winter wind had blown straight into the room. Light from the hallway cast a beam across the floor, illuminating the figure of a man in a pristine olive uniform stepping inside. The 3 silver stars on his collar caught the overhead lights glinting cold and unmistakable, leaving no one in the room the right to look anywhere else. Reed stepped inside, posture, straight gaze, unwavering, the crisp olive uniform on his shoulders, carrying every ounce of authority reflected in each sharp crease. The 3 silver stars on his collar caught the overhead lights, scattering cold points of light that froze everyone in the room. The air, already tense since Grady's return, seemed to compress further, as though a heavy fog had settled over the entire precinct. Reed didn't scan the room to see who was who. He walked directly to the reception counter where a young female officer stood clutching her phone, her hands shaking so hard the screen tilted in her grip. There was no customary greeting, no polite introduction. Reed placed a dark blue folder on the desk, the sound of paper against wood echoing louder than it should have. JAG support confirmation. He said, his voice steady and low, neither harsh nor permitting interruption. Morrison emerged from the back and froze the moment he saw the man in front of him. His first thought was why a military officer was here. But when his eyes reached the 3 silver stars, his foot instinctively slid half a step back, something even he could not stop. His expression shifted within seconds from shock to tight, nervous control. When he tried to speak, the sound that came out was thin, hoarse. "Sir, perhaps we can—" Reed turned his head, and the look he gave Morrison tightened whatever words remained in the man's throat. Video. One word, sharp, direct, and leaving not a single inch of room for excuses. Morrison swallowed his Adam's apple, tightening visibly, then walked toward the control desk like a man being pulled on an invisible leash. The precinct remained silent. No chatter, no whispered explanations, only the sound of Morrison's shoes tapping against the floor, each tap echoing like a countdown in everyone's mind. A young officer, likely the one assigned to manage the camera files for this shift, sat before the large monitor. His head bowed, his fingers hovering above the keyboard, trembling so noticeably he couldn't hide it. He glanced at Grady, then at the stars on Reed's collar, and his shoulders shrank even further. Officer Grady's Bodycam file, sir." His voice thinned to nearly nothing by the end, as though a stronger breath from someone else might blow it away. Grady stood in the corner, leaning against the wall, yet still feeling like he was falling the floor beneath him no longer steady. He sensed the cold blasting from the air conditioner, but sweat still gathered on his forehead. Ever since Reed walked in, every thought had scattered from his mind. He no longer felt like the man with power behind a blue uniform. All he saw now was the truth waiting to be exposed, wearing the shape of the man he had foolishly crossed. Reed stepped back half a stride, so the screen was visible to everyone. He said nothing further, no pressure, no threat, no glance at the others. His eyes held fixed on the blank monitor, as though sheer focus alone could force the truth out of it. The silence was so complete that the typing clicks from the young officer sounded painfully loud, each one marking the search through folders. When the video was selected, the screen flickered for several seconds before stabilizing. The first frame appeared an empty patch of brick ground, a bit of porch in the corner, scattered arcs of water glistening on the surface. But even those few seconds were enough for Reed to recognize the scene, his mother's yard, the exact place he had lifted her not long ago. A slanted stream of water trailed from the porch edge across the bricks, recalling the moment Evelyn could not stay upright beneath the force Grady had aimed at her. Reed's fingers tightened slightly, but his face didn't change. He held the same terrifying calm. People in the room exchanged glances, trying to guess how far this video would go. An older officer by the door shook his head slowly, while a younger one swallowed sharply as if sensing a storm about to break. Morrison's voice rose weakly behind them. "Maybe we could negotiate something," but Reed cut the thought short with a single icy look that made Morrison swallow the rest of the sentence. Another breath passed. Then the first sound in the video erupted. The hiss of high-pressure water blasted from the hose, the sound sharp, forceful, unmistakably intentional. So loud it seemed to pull all other noise out of the precinct, leaving only that violent spray echoing through the room. Everyone instinctively held their breath. Reed tilted his head slightly, eyes still locked on the screen, while Grady's knees bent subtly under him, though he forced himself to stay upright. The footage had not yet reached its worst point, but the noise alone was damning. Every experienced officer in the room recognized immediately this was not a slip, not an accident. This was deliberate force directed at an elderly, defenseless woman. Reed did not move, did not flinch his shoulders like carved stone, yet everyone could feel the tension thickening around him. A young officer whispered without meaning to, barely louder than a breath, "This cannot be defended." No one replied. No one looked his way. But the silence itself became agreement. The monitor's glow cast a cold blue sheen over Reed's face, sharpening every feature, making him look even more formidable, unreadable. And when the sound of the water hissed again, stronger this time, the air in the precinct seemed to freeze in place. No one exhaled. No one shifted. And no one, not even Morrison, still believed this story could be buried. The sound of the water, blasting in the video, rang out again. Sharp, cold, like a blade slicing through the room. The frame shuddered as the Bodycam adjusted its focus, revealing Evelyn's brick yard and Grady's figure standing over her. The hose aimed at an elderly woman who had no means to defend herself. The spray struck her skin with such force that it turned into white streaks on the screen. Everyone in the precinct stared, each processing their own emotions, but sharing one undeniable weight, a heaviness no one could swallow. Reed stood on the far side of the room, his shoulders unmoving by even a fraction. In the blue light reflecting from the monitor, his face looked even sharper, almost carved. Officers nearby risked glancing at him only to feel as though they were staring at a boundary none of them dared cross. The calm on his face was not silence. It was the tight, deliberate control of a man accustomed to facing situations far more dangerous than this. And yet, anyone perceptive enough knew beneath that calm was a rage deep as an abyss. Grady stared at the screen, and his body seemed to shrink inward. He wasn't watching someone else's footage. This was him, his actions, his moment of choosing to wield authority like a weapon, now replaying second by second, turning on him like the feral thing he had tried to keep hidden. When he saw Evelyn buckle under the force of the water, his lips trembled. He turned his face away, unable to look at what he had become. Morrison stood behind him, gripping the edge of the console as if it were the last solid thing left. Inside him, any hope of calling this a misunderstanding or a minor mistake evaporated the moment the video showed Grady hitting Evelyn a second time. Morrison's eyes darkened, not out of anger toward Grady, but because he knew what this meant. Nothing could be sponge-shielded or salvaged. This wasn't just Grady's downfall. It was dragging him and the entire system he had tried to protect down with it. The video shifted to the moment the Christmas wreath fell from Evelyn's hand, bounced on the brick, and snapped a branch under the force of the second spray. An officer near the door closed his eyes briefly, as if he couldn't bear to see more. He had handled difficult cases before, but something about this moment made him feel his profession was losing something it could never afford to lose: humanity. He opened his eyes again, forcing himself to face what was on the screen, rather than hide from it. The audio continued playing. Grady's shout cracked through the speakers like thunder landed on the console, hard, cold, dripping with contempt. "Get up," I said, "get up." Several younger officers flinched at the volume of their colleague's voice. None of them had imagined the day they would hear him speak that way to an elderly woman, to someone slower, weaker, and defenseless, except for a pair of trembling hands. Reed did not move, but those near him could sense his breath deepen, slowing into something dangerously controlled, like a soldier grounding himself before the moment he must strike. He wasn't calm because he lacked anger. He was calm because his anger was waiting for its precise target. When the footage showed Evelyn retreating toward the wooden railing, Reed tilted his head slightly, his eyes darkening. It was the moment he remembered her slow, careful walk from his childhood, the same woman who once shielded him from storms, from hunger, from hardship, now taken a blow meant to break. A young officer near the monitor whispered without intention, Good Lord. He couldn't finish. His voice collapsed as the video showed Evelyn's knees buckle and her hands claw at the wet brick ground. Even the ceiling fan's hum couldn't drown out the suffocating tension spreading through the room. Another officer stepped back half a pace as though needing physical distance from the horror on the screen. Grady swallowed hard and tried to speak. I was just following the procedure. The instant the words left his mouth, even he seemed to shrink from them. Reed turned his face toward him without a word, without a change in posture, and the look alone made Grady's entire body prickle with cold. Morrison shot him a furious glance, angry not at Reed, but at Grady for choosing the single worst sentence possible at the single worst time. Another officer snapped back, voice stronger this time, disappointment burning through every syllable. What procedure allows you to treat an elderly woman like that? The room fell silent. Not the silence of waiting, the silence of realization. Everyone now understood the truth. This had gone far beyond anything that could be excused as a misunderstanding. When the video reached the final section, Grady, lifting the hose once more, aiming it at Evelyn's back, shouting at her like an interrogator, Reed inhaled a slow, heavy breath. He stepped closer to the monitor, standing tall, letting the cold light reflect off his olive uniform. Then he spoke, his voice low but resonant, each word striking the floor like a weighted stone. Every frame of this video will follow you for the rest of your life. Grady lowered his head. His shoulders collapsed. His body seemed to deflate from within. He could no longer look up. Morrison watched him, and in Morrison's eyes was something like the collapse of his own facade. Not sympathy, but the realization that every false report, every excuse he had planned, was now meaningless. As soon as the video ended, the duty room door swung open again. 2 internal affairs investigators entered, both wearing the expression and posture of people who did not need permission from anyone. The one in front spoke first. "We were assigned to respond to an urgent misconduct review. No one asked who called. Even the least experienced officer in the room understood that IA wasn't here for a routine check. They were here because this had become an emergency." The investigators approached Grady. One placed a hand on his shoulder, not harsh, but unmistakably firm. The other spoke, "You're coming with us." Separate statement. Grady almost couldn't move, but IA gave him no space to hesitate. He was taken away like a man who already knew his fate, though no official verdict had yet been spoken. When the door closed behind him, the duty room felt strangely hollow. Morrison stood still for several seconds, staring at the notebook, the false report he had just approved. He knew now he had made a catastrophic error. Just then, the desk phone rang sharply, slicing through the frozen air. The young officer at the desk flinched and grabbed the receiver. Her face shifted from tense to pale in just 2 seconds. She looked at Morrison, then at Reed. A call from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. No one breathed, no one spoke, and in that moment, everyone understood nothing was ending here. Everything was just beginning. The phone on the duty desk still buzzed faintly after the call from the Department of Justice ended, leaving behind a metallic echo hanging in the air like steel striking steel in a dim warehouse. The 2 internal affairs investigators began their work immediately, as if familiar with situations where truth had been stuffed into the dark for far too long and was now being dragged into the light. They opened an incident log, reviewed the copied Bodycam footage, noted timestamps for each frame, and instructed another officer to seal the auxiliary hard drive so no one in the precinct could alter any file. Morrison stood beside the desk like a man stripped of every anchor he once had. He kept wiping sweat from his forehead even though the duty room was cold and the hum of the air conditioning was steady. Each time his fingers touched his skin, a warm, anxious flush spread toward his ears. His chest tightened when Internal Affairs requested the written report he had just approved. He looked down at his shoes and saw the faint dust marks on the toes marks that now felt like a mockery of the confidence he once held. Meanwhile, Reed remained in the same spot, unmoving, not leaving the room, even though the investigation had fully shifted into Internal Affairs' hands. He observed from a distance, standing like a sentinel far enough not to intrude, yet close enough that everyone in the room understood that any attempt at concealment would not escape his eyes. When the phone rang a second time, Reed wasn't the one who answered, but every gaze drifted toward him instinctively, as if seeking direction from the only person in the room who had not wavered. The email from the Judge Advocate General arrived just as Internal Affairs completed their first documentation packet. A young officer opened the inbox, saw the subject line Federal Coordination Approved, JAG Liaison Assigned, and swallowed hard. He looked around as if hoping someone could confirm he had read it correctly. Morrison stepped forward and yanked the monitor subtly toward himself. But once he saw the email, his face steadied, though, in a way more unsettling than panic. It was the calm of a man realizing that every escape route was narrowing by the minute. The desk phone rang again, this time longer. The female desk officer answered, and her face paled as she listened to the voice on the other end. The Department of Justice is requesting a copy of the Bodycam within 1 hour, she said quietly, while setting the phone down as if afraid her own volume might worsen the situation. An officer beside her shook his head and muttered to himself, "This is going way beyond Internal Affairs." Pierce wasn't in the room when the Department of Justice called, but Morrison knew he would hear soon enough. Morrison turned and walked out of the duty room, feeling the floor shift beneath him, not because it was slippery, but because he had just realized he was only one link in a chain of wrongdoing, now being pulled into the open. In the hallway, several officers whispered among themselves, their voices low, rushed, and tight, as though speaking through clenched teeth. When Morrison glanced their way, the conversation died instantly. The atmosphere in the precinct had long since ceased being friendly, but today it was suffocating. Everyone avoided one another's eyes. The young officer who had opened the JAG email leaned against the wall, staring down at his shoes, his mind racing toward the future of the precinct. If JAG is involved, and the Department of Justice too, this isn't internal anymore, he whispered to the officer next to him, shrinking back when Morrison walked past. Inside the duty room, Internal Affairs continued their procedure, requesting that an evidence box be brought in. They transferred the video to an encrypted memory card, sealing each layer according to federal protocol. One investigator logged every step. The other recorded video of the entire handling process to protect against any accusation of tampering by the precinct. Reed watched silently. He didn't intervene, but both investigators knew he was monitoring to ensure everything met federal standards. Morrison made his way toward his office, the fluorescent hall lighting washing his face into an unhealthy pale. Each step felt twice as long. He drew in a shaky breath, telling himself there were still ways to manage this, but even he knew he was feeding himself hollow reassurances. At his office door, his hand rested on the handle for a long moment, as though he already knew he wouldn't like what waited behind it. When he finally pushed the door open, Pierce was already inside. The desk lamp cast a harsh glow across his face, revealing bloodshot eyes. Whether from anger or fear, Morrison couldn't tell. Morrison froze for half a heartbeat. Pierce said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence itself was accusatory, the kind that made Morrison feel as though he had walked into a courtroom without being warned he was the defendant. Morrison spoke first, struggling to maintain composure. The Department of Justice called. Pierce didn't move. Morrison continued. Internal Affairs has seen the video, and JAG has sent confirmation. Every word he spoke felt like it detached from him and dropped to the floor, heavy, irreversible. Pierce stepped closer until only a few feet remained between them. His breaths were thick, his voice kept deliberately low but unable to hide the anger beneath. How did it get to this? He spoke like a man searching for someone to blame, simply because blame was the only thing left to hold on to. Morrison did not answer. There was nothing left to say. His falsified report couldn't change the video. The only thing that had ever helped him bury situations like this was the silence of others, and that silence was now being dragged into a federal current no one could stand against. Pierce slammed his hand onto the desk. The sound struck the room, anger mixed with fear. They're coming. The Department of Justice will not leave this alone. And JAG, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The mere mention of JAG was enough for both men to understand when the military was involved, standards became iron. Morrison's throat tightened, each breath pressing upward like something was lodged beneath his sternum, while the two men stood in the thickening tension of the office footsteps echoed in the hall. Reed walked past the doorway without glancing inside. But even the brief silhouette of him framed in the glass was enough to silence both men for a few seconds, not because Reed threatened them, but because he represented something neither of them could fight: discipline and federal authority. When Reed disappeared down the hall, Pierce turned back to Morrison with an expression he rarely showed: desperation. "We need to talk," Pierce said quietly. "Not now, but soon. If we don't..." He left the sentence unfinished, allowing Morrison's imagination to supply the rest. The air inside the office thickened. The walls felt as though they were closing in with each passing minute. Morrison turned toward the window, where the last of the afternoon light was fading. But the darkness filling the office wasn't from the setting sun, it came from the investigation tightening around the precinct like a noose. The air inside Precinct 12 was thick as condensed fog when the two internal affairs investigators returned to the duty room carrying two evidence boxes. They did not need to make announcements or offer explanations. Moving with the speed of people accustomed to federal-level crises, they began seizing every device and document related to Grady's incident. The auxiliary hard drive was removed from the computer, Grady's Bodycam was placed into a sealed evidence pouch, and the shift's logbook was collected and tagged line by line. Each time a seal was pressed down, Morrison felt as though another strip of skin was being torn from the precinct itself. Reed stood near the doorway, silent. He watched every motion internal affairs, made the way they opened each file, the way they exchanged glances and brief nods instead of words. No one in the IA team dared to act casually. They knew exactly who was in the room. A federal officer could be questioned for careless procedure, but a vice admiral, that was something entirely different. Reed didn't need to give orders. His presence alone made every IA movement precise down to the last detail. Morrison lingered at the back, sweat no longer beading but streaming down his temples. Each time a piece of evidence went into the box, he squinted as though witnessing another brick being pulled from the wall he had built around himself. His thoughts raced, searching for an exit, but the more he searched, the clearer it became. Every door had closed the moment Reed stepped through the precinct's threshold. As internal affairs moved across the room, the duty computer chimed with a sharp ding. The young officer at the console, startled, looked at the screen, then turned toward Morrison. "Email from JAG," he said, his voice cracking. Morrison stepped forward, trying to keep his face from showing panic, but his eyes widened at the first line he read, requesting a complete timeline from the moment Officer Mark Grady exited the vehicle until the end of the interaction. Attached were additional demands for the ship's personnel list, radio logs, and any internal documents related to the event. Morrison's heartbeat faltered. This was no longer legal support. This was JAG formally entering the matter as a federal coordination case. He had no time to recover before the desk phone rang again, faster, more urgent. The female desk officer answered, listened for several seconds, then cupped the receiver with trembling fingers. "The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice is requesting all documentation within 24 hours," she said, each word falling heavy as stone. They believe the incident may indicate a federal-level civil rights violation. A young officer beside her released a shaky breath, speaking softly as if confessing something. This is going federal, for real. He wasn't looking at anyone, but everyone heard him, and no one disagreed. Precinct 12 could no longer shield Grady. Whether they liked it or not, they all understood this had moved beyond their control. Pierce appeared in the hallway the moment the phone clicked back onto its base. His face was stiff, but his eyes failed to hide the constant pounding anxiety beneath. He inhaled sharply, forced his voice to sound firm. We still have control of the situation. But even he seemed confused about who he was trying to convince, Morrison or himself. The officers nearby dropped their gazes to the floor. None of them offered affirmation. They knew control had slipped from their hands long ago. Inside the duty room, IA continued moving, desk to desk, gathering files. Every footstep they took struck the floor like a funeral beat. A senior officer stood against the wall, watching them with shame and dread mixing in his eyes. He had served this precinct for 3 decades and had never seen it fall into such a state, each corner of the room seeming to hold a long-buried secret finally waking up. Reed remained present. He stood in the hallway, only a few steps away like a guardian at a gate. No one knew what he was thinking, but his posture alone made one thing clear: he would not leave until every piece of evidence was protected. Every investigative step followed federal protocol, and every attempt at concealment crushed down to its roots. Morrison stood by the desk, vision blurring as IA removed his logbook. Beyond the window, the afternoon shadows stretched across the pavement, long and fading. He remembered the moment earlier that morning when he told Grady to handle it cleanly, and now that memory pressed into his chest like a barbed iron sphere. He realized the terrifying truth. It was not only Grady who was falling, he was standing on the same edge. Pierce appeared at the duty room doorway and gestured for Morrison to follow. Morrison's steps wavered like a man who had just received a death sentence but had not yet heard it read aloud. He walked through the hallway, where officers shifted aside, avoiding both his eyes and Reed's. Nobody spoke, but the silence was so thick it felt as if the entire ceiling was pressing down. When Morrison entered his office again, Pierce was already inside, standing in the shadow of the tall filing cabinet. Arms folded back, straight eyes fixed on Morrison like he was calculating how much of him could still be salvaged. Morrison shut the door, the soft click sounding like a needle prick in the tense air between them. "You saw it," Pierce said, voice low but sharp like a blade cutting through wind. "Internal Affairs is in. JAG wants a timeline. The Department of Justice is demanding files within 1 day. We're being squeezed from both sides." He stepped closer, his breath heavy. "We're not dealing with a civilian anymore. This is a Vice Admiral from the SEALs." Morrison swallowed the dryness scraping down his throat. "I know," he said, though the words sounded more like a sigh than an answer. He sank into his chair, his head lowering as if all strength had drained from him. He had no idea what to do. There were no scraps left to cling to, no shield left to hide behind, no one left to shift the blame toward. But Pierce refused to let him collapse. Leaning over the desk, palms flat against the cold surface, he said, "We need a plan. If they tie the report to you, you know what happens next." Morrison closed his eyes. He pictured it clearly. Every sentence in that falsified report was a trap he had set for himself, and now there was no one coming to pull him out. "They need one central culprit," Pierce continued. "If it's not Grady, it will be you. And if it's not you, it will be me." He lifted his head, eyes sharp as needles. "We have to decide who will be left behind." Morrison looked up suddenly, eyes widening with horror, not because Pierce was wrong, but because Pierce was right in the most brutal way. This system survived by sacrificing someone to protect many, and today Pierce was proposing a sacrifice. Out in the hallway, the footsteps of Internal Affairs continued their steady rhythm, each step counting down the seconds left before everything caved in. Morrison drew in a tight breath, feeling as though even the air was pressing backward into his lungs. He shifted his chair, powered on the computer, and his hands trembled so violently that he had to rest them on the desk for a few seconds just to steady himself. The screen glowed slowly to life, icons appearing one by one, but Morrison stared at it like a cliff face, fully aware that behind it was a void he had no choice but to step into. The system is protected. He muttered more as a warning to himself than to Pierce. Pierce stood close behind him, leaning in as if he intended to watch every key Morrison was about to press. "Hurry up!" He snapped, his patience completely gone. His breath was hot and heavy against the back of Morrison's neck, worsening the fear already crawling up his spine. Morrison opened a command window. A black screen appeared with a single blinking cursor waiting for instructions. He had to pause again, wiping sweat from his lashes before entering the commands he knew by heart from years of experience. While Morrison typed, Pierce's gaze darted repeatedly to the clock on the wall. Each passing second felt like a blade slicing through his nerves. Both men knew the Department of Justice could send people at any moment. If the video still existed, none of the internal remedies they had planned would survive. Morrison pressed the final key of the command sequence and allowed his hand to hover above the enter key for several seconds, like a man whispering a prayer before he acted. It was all he could do. When he finally struck enter, both men held their breath at the same time. The screen flickered, then a bright red warning box appeared, its white border so stark it could have been read from across the room. Morrison felt his heart twist painfully as the message registered restricted access. JAG lock engaged. He didn't understand at first, but a heartbeat later, the truth slammed into him like a hammer. JAG had locked the system immediately after receiving the first copy of the video. They no longer had access. They no longer had editing rights. They could no longer delete anything. Pierce froze for half a second, then snapped his head toward Morrison with eyes wide in horror. "You're joking," he hissed through clenched teeth as if the message were something Morrison had invented just to torment him. Morrison shook his head, throat dry. "It's not me. They used a federal lock. We have no authority left." The words made the room feel smaller, as though the walls had shifted inward by an inch. Before Pierce could react further, 3 soft knocks sounded at the door. Not hesitant, not aggressive, just 3 steady taps. Both men whipped around, and as the door opened, the first silhouette they saw made Morrison swallow hard. Mick Turner stood there, the precinct's camera technician. He held a small black USB drive in both hands. Those hands trembled, but his eyes were steady, with a resolve that made 2 seasoned officers flinch internally. "What are you doing here?" Pierce snapped, his voice cracking with the strain of losing control. Mick inhaled deeply and squared his shoulders. "I backed up the video when the system auto-synced this morning." His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed clearly. He raised the USB. "It's in here, and I'm not the only one who has a copy." Pierce stepped forward, his expression twisting as quickly as a turning wind. "A backup." "What do you mean by backup? Who told you to do that?" His voice sharpened, but beneath it was the tremor of a man running out of ground. Mick stepped back half a pace, but didn't retreat completely. "The system auto-backs up each shift. I just checked it and sent the backup to JAG when they asked." Every word made the situation worse, but Mick understood he had no choice but to tell the truth. Morrison grabbed the edge of the desk to keep himself upright. His legs felt as though they were sinking into mud with nothing solid left to brace against. His body felt heavy as a stone. His mind reeled. "JAG received the backup?" he asked, as if hoping he had misheard. Mick nodded slowly, giving Morrison time to absorb the blow. "They received it this morning. When they saw potential signs of elder assault, they locked the system from the federal side." A dense silence thickened the room, dark as tar. Morrison turned toward Pierce and saw the shattering in his eyes, something he tried to hide but could not. Sweat slid down Pierce's temples despite the cool air. He no longer looked like a leader. He looked like a man cornered by a rising flood with nothing to hold on to. Mick swallowed hard, but continued, voice trembling with responsibility. "Internal Affairs wants to see you both, right now." He stepped back from the doorway to avoid Pierce's sharp stare, and then turned away, leaving the 2 men standing in the suffocating room. Pierce turned back to Morrison, not with anger anymore, but with a despair so deep it aged him several years in minutes. "We're out of options," he said quietly. His hands fell to his sides as if releasing the last remaining pieces of his defense. They stood there silent. Morrison felt the room begin to spin. Pierce knew that whatever waited beyond that door was not internal review, but an investigation where every answer might drag them deeper. Out in the hallway, the footsteps of internal affairs echoed slowly but steadily, each step a reminder that time was running out. Their shadows appeared beneath the doorframe, pausing outside the office. Morrison stared at that shadow and didn't dare inhale too deeply. His eyes widened with a fear he had not felt throughout his entire career, a fear not of discipline but of being exposed before a justice he had spent years bending. Pierce couldn't stand the closed space any longer. He moved toward the door, placed his hand on the knob, but didn't turn it. His breaths were even but deep, like a soldier bracing for the final charge. "If they want answers," he said, without looking back, "we need to stay consistent." His voice trembled, though he fought to sound firm. Morrison didn't respond. He looked at the screen, still locked by JAG, the red warning message glowing like a verdict. He knew that consistent no longer meant anything. The 3 firmer knocks struck the door. Neither man moved. Neither spoke. Both already knew exactly who was waiting outside. The closed meeting room sat at the end of the hallway, where the dim yellow bulbs, rarely replaced, cast the space in a gloom deeper than usual. Once the door shut behind the last person, the air thickened like old dust stirred after years of stillness. 5 people sat around the worn wooden table. Reed, at the far end facing the door, 2 internal affairs representatives angled to the right, and Pierce and Morrison seated together on the opposite side. No one spoke. Only the hum of the air conditioner filled the space with a steady coldness that made the silence even sharper. Pierce spoke first, and the moment he did his voice no longer carried the firmness of a seasoned supervisor. It sounded like a hastily patched mask of politeness. "Admiral Reed, first of all, we are deeply sorry for what happened this morning." He tried to hold a faint smile, but the twitch at the corner of his eye betrayed his fear. He continued halfway through his next sentence, but the words slid off his tongue the moment Reed's eyes landed on him. Reed did not lean back, yet his posture held like a stone slab weighted into place. That was not an incident. His voice was calm, cold, as a draft slipping through an old door, not loud, not forceful, but definitive enough to slam a period onto Pierce's excuse. Pierce fell silent, his chin pulling inward as if he had been pushed off the ground he believed was safe. Morrison rushed to fill the void, terrified that the last remaining chance was slipping away. Officer Grady acted because he believed Mrs. Evelyn might. He never finished. Reed turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp enough to divide the room into a clean line between truth and fabrication. He attacked an elderly woman who could not defend herself. Each word hit the table like a stone. Reed shifted his gaze to Morrison, and you altered the report to hide it. Morrison inhaled sharply, his hands clasping beneath the table. His fingers trembled as if chilled by winter wind. He wanted to argue, to claim he did not intend harm, that he was merely following internal procedure, but he knew that excuse would bury him deeper. Any justification now would only make him look like a man sinking willingly into his own lie. One of the internal affairs investigators opened a folder on the table, speaking in a tone so neutral it felt inhuman. Documents collected from Precinct 12 show that Officer Morrison's report does not match the Bodycam data. He glanced briefly at Morrison before continuing, his voice steady. The report contains deliberate distortions of the event, including inaccurate descriptions of the victim's behavior and of Officer Grady's actions. Each listed item landed like a hammer, striking a staff of justice that had rusted from disuse. Pierce wiped his forehead, his breath heavy, like someone who had climbed a flight of stairs too quickly. "We can resolve this internally," he said, a trace of desperation cutting through his tone. "There's no need to escalate this to the county level. It avoids unnecessary unnecessary strain on the community. He looked at Reed, searching for mercy from a man he knew he could not match in authority. Reed leaned back slightly, the chair creaking dryly beneath him. "The only strain I see," he said, eyes fixed on Pierce, "is a precinct that does not respect the laws it is sworn to uphold." His voice never rose, but each word seemed to remove oxygen from the room. Even the air conditioner felt like it slowed, leaving the sense that everything inside the space was shrinking around the officers. Morrison bowed his head, his gaze dropping to his interlocked hands. Shame and regret tightened in his throat like trapped gravel. He remembered every word he had written into that report, remembered convincing himself that handling it internally would solve everything. But now, sitting across from a vice admiral from the SEALs, those justifications felt like scraps of crumpled paper blowing away in a storm. Internal Affairs continued reading, and this time their voices carried the polish of a blade freshly sharpened. "We have identified multiple discrepancies between the initial report and the video footage, including misrepresentations of the victim's actions, misrepresentations of Grady's behavior, and the intentional omission of force via water stream as a physical assault." One investigator closed the folder and set it on the table. "These findings meet the threshold for initiating a federal investigation." Pierce spoke again. This time, stripped of all pretense, only raw fear remained. "Admiral Reed, what we did while wrong was not done with malice. We simply tried to prevent unnecessary tension." He looked around the room, hoping for sympathy from someone anyone but met only the firm eyes of Internal Affairs and the silence of Reed. Reed turned his wrist slightly, resting his palm against the wooden table. "Tension does not come from telling the truth," he said slowly, deliberately. "It comes from hiding it." A long pause followed, just long enough for Morrison to lift his head, only to meet Reed's eyes staring straight through him. "And from your belief that you could hide it." No one laughed. No one cleared their throat. The silence was like the moment after a detonation. The debris had not yet settled, but the outcome was already unavoidable. An Internal Affairs investigator withdrew another stack of documents, placing them at the center of the table. "We recommend forwarding the entire case to the district attorney," he stated clearly, without a trace of hesitation, "including the charge of elder assault by Officer Grady and the charge of report falsification by Officer Morrison." His eyes shifted briefly to Pierce. "Leadership concealment within the precinct will be processed as a separate file." Morrison lurched forward slightly as a man shoved toward a cliff's edge. "Wait." He didn't get another word out. Reed's voice cut across the room, not loud, but final. "There is nothing to wait for." He turned to Internal Affairs and gave a small nod. "The file should be forwarded." There was no rage in his voice, no pointing finger. It was the calm that crushed the room more than anger ever could. The atmosphere changed instantly. Pierce pressed his lips together as though standing before a tightening noose. Morrison stared at the file in front of him as if it were a map leading him directly to his own downfall. Internal Affairs gathered the documents, organized them neatly, and signed the preliminary transfer report. Each stroke of the pen sounded like a bolt sliding home on a closing door. Reed remained seated. He looked at the two men before him, watching the fracture spreading across their expressions. Neither of them was his adversary. Neither of them had the strength to cling to the shell of authority they once believed impenetrable. He spoke one final sentence, gentle, yet sharp as a fresh cut. "The law is not something you choose when to apply." Internal Affairs rose, signaling the end of the meeting. Pierce and Morrison stayed seated as if their legs no longer obeyed their commands. The afternoon at Precinct 12 passed under a silence unlike any other day. It was not the silence of busy work, but the silence of a place that had just watched the fortress it trusted collapse from a single fissure. When the Internal Affairs representatives delivered the files to the district attorney, every pair of eyes in the precinct followed them as if watching a group of people carry away a part of the precinct's own body. The feeling was so heavy that even veteran officers did not want to breathe too loudly. At the district attorney's office, the case file was placed on the desk, complete with the signatures of Internal Affairs and JAG. District Attorney Wells opened the stack, his seasoned eyes slicing through each page the way a sharp blade glides through paper. It did not take him long to gather the full picture. 5 charges, he said, his voice steady but heavier than any sound in the room. Elder abuse, excessive force, civil rights violation, false reporting assault on a vulnerable adult. Each word fell like a stone hitting water, sending ripples outward. Grady sat across from him, his face drained of all color. His hand clutched the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. His head hung slightly, yet his eyes remained fixed on Wells as if hoping something might change at the last second. But nothing changed. When Wells read the 3rd charge, Grady's lips trembled, and by the time he reached the last charge, Grady inhaled sharply, just to stop himself from collapsing. He tried to speak, but his throat felt dry as if all moisture had been drained from him. Morrison stood against the wall, hands clasped tightly together. He thought he had prepared himself, but when Wells pronounced the charge of false reporting with his name attached, his legs weakened as though something had ripped the strength from under him. An investigator stepped forward asking him to surrender his badge and firearm. Morrison removed his badge so slowly it looked like he was trying to hold on to the last remnants of his career. When the firearm left his hand, his expression hollowed out as if he had lost his sense of direction. Pierce entered last, just in time to witness Morrison surrendering his badge. Before he could speak, a DOJ investigator handed him an official letter. Mr. Pierce. The investigator read slowly, "The Department of Justice is opening a federal investigation into obstruction of justice related to intentional evidence interference in Officer Grady's case." Pierce's face went pale in a single heartbeat. He glanced at Grady, hoping for solidarity, but found only a face more terrified than his own. In the corner of the room, Mick Turner stood quietly clutching the familiar USB drive. Internal Affairs had acknowledged his honesty, an act he never imagined would become this significant. He recalled hesitating before making the backup. He never thought that decision would place him in a position where every gaze carried gratitude and newfound respect. Turner bowed slightly when Internal Affairs approached to shake his hand. In his years as a camera technician, he had never believed a simple action could become such a crucial anchor. Mr. Harris was escorted in through the side door, leaning lightly on his old wooden cane. His face showed fatigue after a long day of tension, yet his eyes shone brighter than they had in that horrifying morning. When he took his seat, he inhaled deeply to steady his breath. I saw everything he said, his voice trembling but each word solid as a hammer striking stone. He recounted how Evelyn was hit by the water, the way she bent in desperation, and how Grady's voice cut through the air like a blade. Internal Affairs recorded every word. No one in the room took lightly the testimony of an elderly witness who had seen far too much injustice in his life. Reed leaned lightly against the wall near the door, arms crossed. He did not take part in the accusations, nor did he intervene in the questioning. He only observed. Every development unfolded like a piece of a larger order he respected. From the moment he entered the room, he had not spoken once, yet his presence alone held a strange type of respect. Respect not born of rank, but of the sense that this was a man who would not bend to any kind of darkness. Wells closed the folder, exchanged a glance with Internal Affairs, and gave a final nod. Grady rose at their instruction, his hands guided behind him. When the metal cuffs locked around his wrists, the sound echoed through the silent room like the lone note of a grim requiem. The sound made Grady shut his eyes as if finally understanding that the shield of authority he had relied on had shattered beneath his feet. Morrison watched this bitterness in his eyes. He knew this was not just the end of Grady, it was the end of the path Morrison himself had walked for many years. He had always believed he understood the line between internal internal handling and cover-up, but that line had come back to bite him. He wanted to convince himself he had made a momentary mistake, but deep down, he knew this was the consequence of years spent paving the road for things that should never have been ignored. Pierce stood stiff as a statue. He was not in handcuffs, but the DOJ letter in his hand felt heavier than the cuffs on Grady's wrists. Each sentence in the letter reminded him of every action he once believed he could bury forever. He looked around the room for anyone who might help him navigate this, but no one returned his gaze with the familiarity he once took for granted. The precinct commander's chair he had been proud of now looked like a trap he had built for himself. Mr. Harris placed a hand on his cane and rose slowly after signing his statement. He glanced toward Reed, and they exchanged a brief look that said more than any words could. There was pain relief and the respect of one seasoned man for another who had stood up at the right moment. He left the room with slow but steady steps, as if releasing a weight that had pressed on his chest since morning. Internal Affairs gathered the files, Wells signed the filing documents, and officers escorted Grady out. As he passed Reed, Grady looked away as though avoiding a light too bright. There was no hatred in Reed's eyes, only a clarity that made Grady unable to hold his gaze. He lowered his head and hurried into the hallway where the last light of day cast a long, pale streak across the floor. In that moment, a young officer near the door whispered to his partner, voice low but heard by all, "This precinct will never be the same again." The words hung in the air like the final comma at the end of a closing chapter. The morning of the trial opened under a sky thick with gray, as if the entire city was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. In front of the county courthouse, local news vans lined up in rows. Residents gathered in murmuring clusters, mostly neighbors from Elmwood Drive, people who had lived there long enough to know this case would not end with a few lines of apology. Officers from Precinct 12 were present as well, some standing off to the side with heavy expressions. When the transport van stopped, the doors opened and Grady stepped out with his hands cuffed in front of him. He kept his head lowered, unable to hide how pale he looked. The orange jumpsuit stiffened in the cold morning wind, turning a man who once swaggered with arrogance into something small and fragile. Inside the courtroom, the empty seats quickly filled. The air felt thick like chalk dust still suspended after a hard impact. Several internal affairs officers took their seats. Dr. Cooper waited in the gallery, and in the center, Evelyn sat beside Reed, her hands resting on her lap, fingers interlaced to hold herself steady. Reed sat beside his mother, back straight gaze calm but sharp, observing every detail in the room with the instinct of someone who had survived hundreds of life and death briefings. He had not come to retaliate. He had come to ensure justice did not drift even a fraction off course. When Grady was brought in, the faint rattle of the cuffs broke the silence. He scanned the room with darting eyes until they landed on Reed. The moment their eyes met, even for a heartbeat, he immediately dropped his gaze as if that look had crushed the air from his lungs. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The courtroom settled into solemn silence. The prosecutor placed a thick stack of files on the desk and began with a voice neither loud nor soft, but sharp as a thin blade. She listed each charge without embellishment, without dramatizing, reciting every line from the file as if striking down Grady's spine one blow at a time. Elder abuse, excessive force, civil rights violation, false reporting assault on a vulnerable adult. Each charge rippled through the courtroom, making Grady bow his head lower. His attorney swallowed hard, breathing like someone swimming against a current. When the prosecutor finished, she signaled. A court technician stepped forward, inserted a USB drive into the slot of the large monitor. The courtroom fell silent. The Bodycam recording appeared. The first frame showed Evelyn's yard. The hose nozzle twisted the sound of water blasting out like a cold blade ripping through the air. Evelyn stepped backward in the footage, shoulders trembling under the force of the spray, while Grady's voice barked, "I told you to turn it off. can't you hear?" Some people in the room held their breath. Others frowned as if feeling the sting of the spray on their own skin. When the video showed Grady blasting her again, forcing her to collapse onto her knees, a wave of alarmed murmurs swept across the gallery. Grady shut his eyes, his body sagging another degree. His attorney jumped up, requesting the court cease further playback due to emotional impact, but the judge declined, allowing the entire recording to run. At this point, words meant nothing in the face of such raw, undeniable evidence. When the video ended, the prosecutor called the first witness, Mr. Harris. The elderly man stepped up slowly, gripping the railing with both hands to steady himself. Although his voice trembled, the truth he spoke was crystal clear. He described each second, hearing the shouting, watching Evelyn being struck by water, and calling 911 in desperation. The courtroom remained utterly silent as he recounted Grady's voice more like someone venting rage than someone carrying out procedure. His testimony stirred a rise in outrage throughout the room, making Grady keep his head buried. The next witness was Evelyn. Reed helped her stand, guiding her step by step toward the stand. The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. She spoke with a tired but steady voice, saying she had only wanted to water her flowers to welcome her son home after many months away. She recounted the moment the wreath slipped from her hand, the branch snapping, and how something felt like it broke inside her as well. When she described the water hitting her face and her vision blurring, she paused, a long, fragile pause that made many in the room lower their gaze, feeling the humiliation she had endured. Reed watched her, his hand lightly gripping the side of her chair as if trying to pull that pain into himself. When she finished, Grady's attorney rose. He spoke at length, recycling worn-out arguments. Officer Grady was performing his duty. The hose caused a slip. The suspect did not comply, and other attempts to dilute the truth. But the moment he said Officer Grady acted according to procedure, Reed stood. He did not move forward. He simply rose, straightening to full height, eyes fixed on the judge. What procedure permits assaulting an elderly woman standing in her own yard? His voice was not loud, but it froze the entire courtroom. Grady's attorney opened his mouth, yet said nothing further. The judge surveyed the room for a few seconds, then lowered his eyes to the file before him. His gavel tapped once against the wood, dry sharp. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds the defendant, Mark Grady, guilty on all 5 charges. Each charge was read again, this time for the legal record, and hereby sentences him to a total of 10 years incarceration. The final strike of the gavel landed, severing the last illusion of authority Grady once held. He staggered, and 2 officers had to steady him as they secured the cuffs and led him away. In the hallway, the midday light fell across faces still tight with emotion. Reed stepped out with Evelyn guiding her down the steps. He helped her into the car, then turned back to look at the courthouse as though seeing a door that had finally closed. That night, Reed hung a new wreath on the front porch. The green leaves and small red berries swayed lightly in the breeze, an emblem restored after a long day. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes calmer now. When Reed closed the door, the military phone in his pocket vibrated softly. A new message appeared. "There is an incident near Northbrook Base. You are the most suitable to assess it." He looked at the screen for a few seconds, his eyes settling back into the familiar steadiness. He put the phone away and glanced at the peaceful street outside, knowing the quiet hid shadows behind the Christmas lights. Justice never sleeps, he murmured as a promise to the world and to himself. His journey was only beginning. Justice will rise.